Today, we're going to delve into Christopher Nolan's masterpiece, Interstellar. First, let's talk about the film's music. But before that, let's discuss the role of music in general. Throughout history, music has always been used to alter people's moods, even in warfare. The rhythmic sound soldiers could march to increase synchronization, and the right rhythms could even affect their hormones, flooding them with adrenaline. For instance, the Isengard theme in The Lord of the Rings was composed specifically for this purpose. But there are some emotions that are hard to convey through music like despair. Ramin Djawadi, known for his work on Game of Thrones, is one of the few who can make you feel despair through music. Now, do you know what's even more challenging? Conveying concepts, not emotions, through music. For instance, can you illustrate time, something we don't fully understand, through music? I may not be on the side that can convey it, but I'm definitely on the side that can understand it. I've listened to many pieces that reminded me of time, made me feel its essence. I could never have imagined that a concept like time could be conveyed so clearly through mere notes, as Hans Zimmer did. Even people who hadn't seen the film but heard the music could sense that it was about time. Tell me, how many pieces of music in the world can achieve this? And I'm not just talking about film scores. I'm talking about all music. How many pieces can serve their purpose so well? Many of you might think that film scores are composed after the film is finished. However, except for very rare exceptions, film scores are usually prepared before the film's distribution and shooting are complete. Musicians are often given a brief on the type of music needed, and they do their best based on the information provided. But there was something special about the process between Hans Zimmer and Nolan. After finishing the script and deciding who would work on the film, especially who would compose the music, Nolan would sit down with pen and paper and write a metaphorical story. He would then send this story to the musician. He did the same for Hans Zimmer. Christopher Nolan wrote a short, completely emotional, and metaphorical story about a father and his child, and sent it to Hans Zimmer in an envelope. Hans Zimmer, upon reading the story, was captivated. It was a story completely unrelated to the film, with not the slightest bit of science fiction in it, just about the importance of being a father. Then Hans Zimmer, reflecting on his relationship with his own children, began composing the film's music, thinking about time and longing. What's fascinating is that Hans Zimmer prepared the main themes of all the film's music on the very day he received the letter. After composing all day, Hans Zimmer invited Nolan to his home the next day to listen to the compositions. Nolan, without commenting on the music, simply said, "I better start making the movie," stood up, and left Hans Zimmer's house. Describing this situation feels like recounting a story from a Shakespearean comedy rather than discussing the film's production process. I don't usually consider myself a romantic in a literary sense, but the fact that such a strong friendship between these two could give us such masterpieces deeply moves me. Usually when talking about Nolan in videos, I refer to him as Nolan, but as you know, that's his last name. His first name is Christopher, and he goes by Chris. I mention this because one of the film's greatest successes belongs to a Nolan, but this time, not to Chris Nolan, it belongs to his brother Jonathan Nolan. In fact, the entire film project was originally his. Let me briefly explain the process. One day, Jonathan Nolan went to Paramount and said, "Let me write a hard science fiction screenplay." The studio liked the idea and convinced Steven Spielberg. Jonathan Nolan was actually writing the screenplay not for his brother, but for Steven Spielberg. However, at some point, Spielberg made a sudden decision to leave the project to direct another film. Paramount then panicked, wondering what to do. Jonathan Nolan had an interesting idea. He said, "Well, I have a brother. He's also into directing. He understands sci-fi and time. Maybe you could talk to him. He's with Warner Brothers, but we can find a middle ground." And he added that this would give him more time to work on the sci-fi aspects. The studio liked the idea, and Christopher Nolan was brought on board. Naturally, the film was delayed for a few years during this process. But during this time, while Jonathan Nolan was writing the script, he involved renowned physicist Kip Thorne, and together they revised the film's entire scientific foundation. Except for the fictional parts, like the construction of a four-dimensional tesseract inside a black hole, they ensured that the film remained faithful to scientific principles. Kip Thorne not only made the screenplay scientifically accurate, but also wrote an academic book detailing the scientific concepts in the film. For those interested, the book is titled The Science of Interstellar. Kip Thorne didn't just act as a script consultant. He also wrote special equations for all the scenes requiring physics in the film's visual effects engines. For example, the visual effects for the black hole, named Gargantua, involved countless pages of equations, leading to the development of a simulator based on those equations, which was then used to create the visual effects. There are dozens of scientific papers worldwide just on the visual effects related to the black hole in the film. Moreover, these scientific papers were published in prestigious, peer-reviewed journals. Imagine making a film that leads to thousands of scientific papers being written about it, hundreds of which are prestigious. While we're on the topic of visual effects, I'd like to touch on the depiction of the black hole in Interstellar. When the film was released, no actual photos of a black hole had been taken yet. Years later, the necessary techniques were developed, and the first black hole photograph was captured. You might have noticed the similarity between the black hole in the film and this photograph. The most significant difference is that we see the black hole from the side in the film, whereas the photo shows it from the pole. If we could view Gargantua from the poles, we'd see a similar image. The reason for this similarity lies in the equations Kip Thorne developed, as I mentioned earlier. Just in the past few years, dozens of papers have been written about the similarities between these images. By the way, I'd like to share one last piece of information about the book. I know that many of you, even if you're interested in the topic, won't read the book for one reason or another. But if you search for the same title on YouTube, you'll find a video presentation by Kip Thorne explaining the book's fundamental concepts. We've delved deeply into the scientific aspect, so let's take a look at the universe created in the film. As usual, Nolan uses the first half hour of the movie to explain the rules and the history of the world he's built, and once again, he prefers to show rather than tell. For instance, let's take the baseball conversation between Cooper and his father-in-law. There, his father-in-law says, "In my day, we had real athletes," and Cooper replies, "In my youth, we didn't have time for baseball because we were fighting for food." This tells us that when the scarcity began, people first started fighting for food, and then, realizing it was futile, the world focused on agriculture, which allowed them to manage the situation temporarily. When Cooper talks to his children's teachers, we learn more about this world. For example, when Cooper finds out his son can't go to college, he asks, "I'm still paying taxes, so where's the money going now that there's no military?" This reveals that not even the military is funded anymore, indicating severe budget cuts. We also learn from the film's dialogue that the world entered this difficult period due to the evolution of an organism called a blight, which breathes nitrogen. It reproduces quickly, spreads with the wind, affects plant photosynthesis, and as a result, only okra and corn can be grown, and soon, even okra won't be possible. Although it may not have as prominent a place in science fiction as meteors or aliens, a plant disease similar to the blight in the film is actually one of the biggest threats to our world from a scientific perspective. This choice made the film appealing to viewers tired of classic end-of-the-world themes. As far as I know, this decision came from Jonathan Nolan, so I want to give him special recognition. Although Jonathan Nolan isn't as famous as his brother because he's a screenwriter, not a director, I can confidently say he's one of the most valuable minds in contemporary science fiction. Just think he's been a screenwriter for projects like Person of Interest, Westworld, and Interstellar, and has consulted on countless other major and unique works. I hope he starts working with his brother again, so we can see more works like Interstellar, The Prestige, and Batman. Now let's look at the etymology in the film, starting with the most obvious. Cooper named his daughter Murphy. While the film briefly mentions it, let's explore it further. Murphy's Law is named after Edward Murphy, Jr., an engineer who worked for the U.S. Air Force. Due to a seemingly trivial reason, he conducted a failed experiment and wrote in his report, "If there's more than one way for an event to occur and one of those ways can lead to disaster, it will happen." Notice how Murphy's Law plays out several times in the film, like receiving the wrong signal from the planet where time passes quickly, the mishaps on that planet, and how these cost them decades. But the most interesting etymological reference, in my opinion, is Dr. Man. Though spelled with an N, it's not much different from the word man. Both words mean human or mankind, and can also refer to a male. In this context, Dr. Mann represents many aspects of humanity. He is noble, honorable, and virtuous enough to go on a suicide mission to save humanity's future. But he's also selfish enough to jeopardize humanity's future out of fear of dying on the planet he's on. However, Dr. Mann's most significant contribution to the film, in my view, is when he says, "Don't judge me, Cooper. You've never been tested like I have." First, let's take a look at Dr. Mann's test. Although Dr. Mann successfully lands on the planet, he discovers it's uninhabitable. For years, he searches for a habitable place but never finds one. He knows that if he pushes the button, someone will come to save him, but it could also mean the end of humanity's future. Dr. Mann resists the urge to press the button for years, but when his food runs out and he faces his final sleep, he succumbs to his survival instinct and presses it. However, Cooper wouldn't have pressed the button if he were in the same situation. He would have chosen to die, because Cooper had lives he valued more than his own, namely his children. Alongside the survival instinct, one of the strongest instincts is the drive to continue one's lineage. From the first single-cell organism to you, there's been one unbroken cycle over millions of generations. Survive, reproduce, and then die. You are the descendants of those who followed this cycle, while those who couldn't died before reaching reproductive age, left behind on the evolutionary ladder. Whether you agree or not, the Nolan brothers clearly suggest in the film that people with children care more about the future of the world. But do you know what's most beautiful? Dr. Mann's line, "Very few have been tested like I have." Notice he says few have been tested, not no one has been tested. A group that was tested in a similar way was Nikolai Vavilov and his colleagues. If I told the whole story, it would take too long, so I'll summarize it. Nikolai Vavilov, one of the first scientists to understand the importance of genetics, believed that the knowledge he gained about genes could save Russia from famine. He and his team collected tens of thousands of seeds from around the world and cataloged them by type. Stalin, who didn't believe in genetics, had Nikolai Vavilov arrested, and he eventually died of starvation. Among those who starved to death were also Nikolai Vavilov's colleagues. Some even say that cataloging these thousands of different chickpeas, tens of thousands of different wheat varieties, and countless beans advanced agricultural production by several centuries. They may not be wrong. That's why the seed bank in Russia, created in their memory, is now the world's most diverse seed bank. I simplified the story a lot, but there's an excellent episode about this in the Cosmos documentary series, specifically in the New World season, which I highly recommend watching. I don't know if there are others who have been tested so harshly with months of starvation and starvation-related deaths for the sake of humanity's future and science. I admit that I've been overly talkative for a single line from Dr. Mann, but with this context, the line "very few have been tested like I have" feels much more meaningful to me. Now let's move on to the masterfully crafted foreshadowing. I said foreshadowing, but actually, there's only one that's really special to me. At the beginning of the film, when Cooper tells his daughter, "I can't be your ghost now," and then actually becoming her ghost at the end of the film, it deeply moved me emotionally and surprised me. The revelation that the beings helping Cooper and all of NASA, who were referred to as they throughout the film and were implied to be aliens, were actually Cooper himself, is a rare example of narrative brilliance. But of course, while the entities we thought were they turned out to be Cooper, there's still another they who built the four-dimensional tesseract for Cooper, pulled him out of the black hole, sent him next to the portal, and placed the portal near Saturn. I don't believe the beings who opened the portal and built the tesseract were future humans, because that would lead us into a kind of paradox. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll truly learn who they are. Let's talk about the film's ending. In my opinion, the film ended in the best way possible. Cooper setting off to find Brand, or rather, to join her, is a great finale. The most surprising thing about the film's ending is how many people seem to be confused by it. Due to spending more time than expected on the planet where time passes quickly, time on Earth advanced significantly. But that wasn't the only advance. If you remember, after Cooper locks onto his spaceship to save it from exploding in the planet's atmosphere, they unintentionally get caught in the gravitational pull of the black hole, Gargantua. Cooper turns this to their advantage, using it to reach the one planet they hadn't yet explored. The slingshot maneuver not only accelerates their spaceship, but also causes time to speed up for them, as they approach the massive gravitational force of Gargantua. During this maneuver, Cooper says, "This maneuver will cost us about 50 years, meaning that Brand also jumped far ahead in Earth time, just like Cooper. But unlike Cooper, she didn't return home. She believes that Cooper was lost in the black hole and that the only way to save humanity is to establish a colony on the planet they brought the embryos to. Cooper, meanwhile, talks to his daughter in the hospital, while Brand is alone on the new planet, thinking the entire world has perished. She doesn't know that Cooper manipulated gravity within the Tesseract inside the black hole to send his daughter the equation that saved the world. She's trying to complete Plan B on her own in another galaxy, possibly the loneliest person in the universe. Cooper, on the other hand, steals a spaceship and aims to go back through the same portal, back to the same system, but this time directly to the planet where Brand went. Maybe he wants to be one of the first people on what could become humanity's new home. Remember what Cooper said to his father-in-law at the beginning of the film? "We used to be explorers." With the final scene, he sets off to become an explorer one last time with the spaceship he stole from the descendants of his grandchildren.